students, today the topic of presentation is market and globalization. We're going to try and understand the phenomena of markets and how sociology tries to understand market as a social institution. We're going to try and understand the more dominant perspectives on looking at the market within sociology and anthropology. We will also, very importantly, try and understand the central role of market in globalization and the importance of neoliberal ideologies which have altered the way in which we understand the functioning and role of markets in contemporary society. I would begin by stating that there is a difference in the way in which the discipline of economics and sociology look at the phenomena of the market. They don't see it in the same way. Now, within economics, markets are seen as mechanisms of demand and supply. They are considered to be self-regulatory, which is that they are capable of reaching an equilibrium on their own. They are envisaged as spaces of free and fair competition and means of achieving economic freedoms. So they are conceived as a coordinating, self-regulating mechanism that caters to both individual as well as collective interests by allocating resources and determining prices. So there is this idea that if you let the market function on its own, it's going to ensure the good of all individuals as well as the good of the entire society, right? So this goes with the idea in economics that markets do not really need constraints or regulation from other social institutions, most dominantly the state, to actually be effective and to lead to economic benefits. So if markets are led to function on their own, they are capable of performing regulative functions by themselves. Now, in sociology, however, markets are seen slightly differently. Sociology looks at markets as a social phenomena and as institutional arrangements of exchange. So basically for sociologists, market is a social institution, which means it has normative patterns, it has rules and regulations such as terms of exchange, property relations, governmental regulations, etc. Right? Markets are also seen as forms of action, relationships, and networks. Now, say for instance, for Weber, market is a form of economic action which is contingent on relationship between actors. So in a market, any action is directed towards other prospective buyers and sellers who are interested in transacting. So Weber also demonstrated how markets as economic action are embedded in other forms of social structures, etc. He's most famously known for his work on the elective affinity between ascetic Protestantism, which is a form of sort of religious doctrine, and sort of the spread of capitalist enterprise in Western Europe. Now, sociologists also tend to conceive of markets as structures and subsystems, right? So, particularly functionalists like Talcott Parsons, they see that, market is one institution and, among other institutions, which perform very important functions for society. So if for a society to survive, there are certain functions that institutions must perform. For Parsons, they are fourfold, which he calls functional imperatives. They are adaptation, goal attainment, integration, and latency. And it is market which performs the function of adaptation, which is securing resources for production and its distribution. So the economy adapts to the environment for the social purpose of provisioning of goods and services. In a capitalist society, this is continuously shifting on the basis of supply and demands of goods and services. Now, markets in sociology are also seen as a social phenomena characterized by configurations of power and conflict of interest. So in the market, you may have the dominance of certain political groups and and this may lead to certain kinds of monopolistic tendencies. And at the same time, not every individual or not every group of individuals have the same amount of access to the market. Also, sociologists tend to see markets as cultural phenomena, which means that, say for instance, the expansion of markets, the fact that we are compelled to buy and sell, right, is concomitant with values of consumerism, right, where you feel that in order to have a good life you need to buy more, right? So markets are also then cultural phenomena. So as you can see, there are slight differences between the way in which economics and sociology perceive the market. Now, Dennis Vidal notes that there is a contradiction between, of course, new classical approaches in economics and sociology and anthropological sort of approaches to the market. But there is also a paradox. So on one hand, what the anthropologists accuse the economists of is that they say that they ignore the social and cultural constraints that inform the market, right? But at the same time, these anthropologists and sociologists also tend to argue that the market obliterates social and cultural relationships. So in a sense, they end up sort of validating the neoclassical economic perspective. However, anthropologists have insisted that through their study of non-Western cultures, that the universalization of the economic model of the West is something that is problematic. They say that the Western model is a specific historical development, and it does not address cross-cultural specificities in the way economic activities are organized, and so it should not be employed as a kind of standard against which all other societies are measured. Karl Polanyi's work is considered canonical in this approach towards market, and he, along with his sort of those who espouse this kind of position, are referred to as substantivists. I'll sort of run you through some of Karl Polanyi's broader understanding of the market, where he says that he sees the Western market economy as a culmination of particular historical and cultural forces, and hence this cannot be seen as a model for all societies, as I had just pointed out. Now, Polanyi distinguishes between two forms of economies, the embedded and disembedded economies. Now, in a disembedded economy, the economic sphere becomes a distinct domain which is separate, segregated, insulated from the rest of society, right? And the idea is that this domain has its own set of laws which is separate from other institutions like politics, religion, family, and other aspects of society. Now, the Western capitalist society is based on an idea of the market where everything is a commodity with prices which are based on demand and supply. Now, the market is dominated, according to Polanyi, by two distinct motives. One is hunger, which is demand, and the other is gain, which is the desire of supply. Now, the exclusive emphasis on only these two motives, that is hunger and gain, actually lead to the distinctiveness of the economic sphere in Western societies. And individuals, in order to survive in sort of such a setup, have to buy commodities from the market with the help of the incomes that they earn. Now, how do they earn their income? They earn their income from selling of other products. Now, which includes one's own labor, because labor is also brought and sold in, a capitalist market. So all incomes effectively derive from sales, and all sales eventually contribute to production. So this is how the system operates. Now, hunger and gain, while they are the two dominant motives, it's important to understand that they are no more economic than, say, for instance, the motive of love, hate, prejudice, right? And which can also be employed by sort of societies in order to survive and sustain themselves. So, and this is what Karl Polanyi points out, that if you look at Western context, then their economy is structured very differently. It is not a distinct domain. In fact, it is embedded in other social institutions, right? So here the motives of gain and hunger do not become preponderant. So he calls non-Western economies embedded economies. Why? Because production in such societies are enmeshed with kinship, religion, and other social domains. Again, a classic example that he provides is of the Trobriand islanders who, where the fundamental principle is not of the market, but it's the principle of reciprocity and gift giving, which is central to agricultural production in society. So sharing of resources among the Trobriand islanders is contingent on kinship relations and obligations, and they are not driven by distinctively economic motives. So now, unlike this substantivist position, you have what are called the formalists, who tend to argue that despite differences in economic organization across cultures, so yes, the Western society is different in the way in which it carries out its economic activity from non-Western societies, but you can still sort of abstract certain fundamental principles, economic principles, which can be applied across all societies. So the formalists will tend to argue that there are certain universals like scarcity. All societies experience scarcity, and they all have self-interested actors who are interested in maximizing their own behavior. We'll now try and understand how the market has evolved historically, and to this effect we'll look at Gerard Berthoud's important distinction between market as public place and market as a principle for regulation of social relationships. Now, for Berthoud, the market as a place is a bounded, situated phenomena that is clearly separated from ordinary life. Now, what are the general characteristics of a marketplace? He says that it is generally located from, at a distance from the inhabited area. It is a neutral meeting place. It may be located in the periphery, but now sometimes what happens is that the marketplace may not be located in the periphery, but it is still seen as a lesser form of activity. It is seen as a debased form of activity. In the marketplace, individuals are free and self-interested, and rules and obligations that would limit individual action in the community are no longer applicable. What basically this means is that, individuals are influenced by social institutions, right? But when you enter a market, the hold of these institutions and the kind of obligations that are expected out of this are sort of kept at bay in the marketplace. So they are liberated from community ties and cultural constraints and become strangers. They transact with other strangers basically for mutual advantage. So the marketplace of principle of free individuals buying and selling commodities at competitive prices is contained within the marketplace. So the marketplace is a space where the market principle and the market mechanism operates, right? Now, Berthoud notes a historical shift where the market principle, which is initially contained in the marketplace, gets more generalized and becomes a way in which the entire society regulates and operates, right? And this happens in the late 18th and the early 19th century, that market systems are transformed, and this happens when both products and factors of production become commodities, which means that goods and services become commodities, and factors of production, that is labor, also becomes a commodity, as I had previously pointed out. Now, Berthoud notes a sequential evolution of markets, right? It's not exactly linear, but it happens in a sequential order. So he says initially you have societies which have a marketplace which contain and limit the market principles. So say for instance among the Hausa in Nigeria, you have a specific marketplace where people of different ethnic origin come and buy and sell, and then they go back to their sort of villages and towns, and which are informed by the traditional social structures, etc. Next, in the historical evolution of market, you have societies where economic activities are not necessarily taking place within limits or only in the marketplace, but those who engage in mercantile activities, the people who engage in it, are considered to belong to lower categories or groups of society. They are generally foreigners, strangers, or they are tolerated but deprived of social status. So the idea that economic activity, mercantile activities, activities related to the market are seen as lesser. They are sort of seen as inferior forms of social interaction. And examples of the second stage include ancient Greece, dynastic China, and European Middle Ages of the second stage. In the final stage, you have the economic modernity, which is what you see in Western societies, where the market is viewed as an important integrative source and is, of course, the way in which the capitalist system sort of reproduces itself. And all limits to its expansion becomes unacceptable, which means by the time of economic sort of modernity, there is a consensus that market is an important way of regulating, coordinating societies, and the fundamental way in which economic development can take place. Now we're going to try and understand the relationship between globalization, neoliberalism, and markets. Now, globalization is an umbrella term that is used to denote a range of economic, political, and socio-cultural phenomena by which nations and individuals come to inhabit an interconnected and interdependent world. Now, globalization, of course, is a product of rapid developments in information and communication technologies, which, of course, lead to a compression of time and space, which allows for global connectivity and interchanges and exchanges between various nations of the world. Now, we are, of course, however, going to focus on a very specific aspect of globalization. Globalization has political, social, cultural dimensions. We're going to look at economic globalization specifically, which is linked to the spread of capitalism, so it's associated with global capitalism and the global expansion of markets and an international division of labor. Now, this has been variously described as post-industrial society, the information age, knowledge economy, etc., because here ICTs are fundamental to the economic process, and it entails integration. That this integration of the world economy is actually premised on a set of global consumers who are technologically literate and are capable of using these information communication technologies both for work as well as leisure activity. The most fundamental organization in a globalized world, economic organization, are transnational corporations. Examples being the Pepsi, Coca-Cola, etc. And they're oriented towards global markets and global profits. They dominate world trade, they diffuse technology across nations, are an important player in international financial markets. And their expansions, particularly after the post-World War years, has been attributed to the consolidation of 3 regional markets, right? So they were able to both sell and buy at these 3 important markets, which is the European market, the Asia Pacific, and the Northern America. And this was made possible because in these markets there was a reduction of trade barriers, right? And today it is important to point out that there are very few nations which are free from the incursions of transnational organizations. Now, transnational organizations are associated with global commodity chain of raw materials, labor, commodities across nations in a bid to reduce costs and maximize sales across the globe. Now, Theodore Levitt has pointed out that the globalization of market actually occurs when you try to sell standardized consumer products across the globe, right? So you try and create standardized global markets. So this is actually premised on a homogenization of consumer demands, right? And this homogenization occurs despite national cultural differences. Now, in this context, Levitt makes a distinction between 2 kinds of organization. The multinational firm, which tends to cater to national differences. Now, when you try to sell products and modify them on the basis of how different nations will consume them, it actually increases your cost, right? So then what happens is that in a globalized situation, these companies do not fare very well in terms of productivity and profits, right? But global corporations, according to Levitt, are those which are able to sell the same standardized product across the world, right? And they promise cheaper rates, but they maintain the quality of the product. So they have a certain sense of being a global quality product. Often the global here means Western in a certain sense. So global corporations, in order to remain competitive, treat the world as composed of few standardized markets rather than many customized ones. Global homogenization in terms of standardized goods is made possible by keeping price low and aggressive marketing, and technology, of course, plays a very important role here. And the best combination of price, quality, reliability, and delivery of products are provided so that the markets are homogenized. So say, for instance, if you notice, Lay's chips, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, these are things that are consumed all over the world, even in the remotest parts. So you will see, even in villages, you may not have adequate infrastructure, etc., but you will still see a small shop, which is offering, Lay's chips and Coca-Cola. So that shows the globalization of markets and the way in which standardized products produced by these globalized corporations have actually reached all corners of the world and are leading to enormous profits. Now, this expansion and globalization of markets is actually linked to a new kind of political ideology, which is called neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism is defined as a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can be established by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong property rights, free market, and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. So this is basically a form of market-driven economic development, where the state actually allows privatization and it protects property rights and ensures that it creates adequate conditions for the functioning and operation of markets in a society. So the state must follow a policy of minimum intervention and let markets do their thing. And states may end up in this instance, of course, serving the interest of only the powerful groups in society, but it has to. But still, the idea is that it must recede in a certain sense. Now, neoliberal ideologies confirm that institutions of market do not require external forces. They can manage themselves. They are self-regulatory. So it's the point that, you know, economists have made, that markets are self-regulatory. So, and that they can themselves guide individual and collective action. So now you do not need a state to regulate market. Rather, the market can regulate the whole of society. Right? And this idea actually held sway after the failure of the communist regime, which these regimes were premised on central planning and economic development. So when these regimes failed by sort of the 1991, neoliberalism became the only political ideology to sort of embrace, and it was of course linked to liberal democracies in a certain sense. But the history sort of goes back to the 1970s, where it is during the 1970s that a link is made between sort of economic growth and technological innovation. And the idea is that all social problems can be dealt with through economic growth. And economic growth, of course, has an individual dimension, which is seen in the material well-being of the individual, right? So, and this economic growth and material well-being of the individual, or you know what would then be termed as economic development, was made possible only through integration of the national economy to international markets, right? And this is what neoliberal basically means, that connecting, you know, local markets to national markets, connecting the national market to the local market. So it's the globalization of markets, as Levitt has pointed out. Now, however, what led to this understanding of neoliberalism? So we have to go a little back in history to understand this, because between the 1950s and 1970s, there was actually a lot of regulation of markets by states. And this was referred to as embedded liberalism, which involved state-led development that focused on employment generation, economic growth, welfare of all citizens by providing them with education and health care. And so market processes and entrepreneurial and corporate activities were subject to certain sort of checks and balances and social and political constraints by a state-regulated environment. Now, neoliberalism, on the other hand, is the removal of all these sort of, you know, barriers on capital and market. By the late 1960s, what happened is that embedded liberalism started to fail. Why? Capital accumulation dipped. Prices became very high, tax revenues plunged, social expenditure of the state increased, and unemployment was in an all-time high. Unemployment rates increased. So it is in this context that, you know, there was a global phase of stagflation, which is stagnancy and inflation, price rise, throughout the 1970s. And this is what sort of led to the move towards neoliberalism. Now, of course, there are scholars who point out that, you know, there may have been other mechanisms to resolve the kind of problem that capitalism was facing, and you know, in the time of embedded liberalism. But the idea that neoliberalism was chosen was also because of the fact that neoliberalism is a mechanism by which the economic elites can actually restore their economic power and capitalist accumulation, which had gone down substantially during the sort of 1970s as a result of the failure of the embedded liberal system, which was more interested in, you know, social distribution of wealth rather than the accumulation of capital among the economic elite. Now, Harvey notes that neoliberalism actually requires certain form of creative destruction, which means this idea that the state must recede, that the state must not be a nanny state providing welfare services, and that the market should be allowed to intervene in all aspects of our life. That requires, you know, an erosion of earlier sort of ideas of, you know, tradition and culture, you know, and other kinds of cultural practices such as myth, rituals, mutual aid, and other forms of social solidarities, which can come into conflict with market values, right? So what Harvey notes is that, you know, there has to be a substantial cultural change for neoliberal values to be embedded in sort of late modern societies. And it requires a kind of institutionalization of discontentment and unhappiness, which will drive consumerist behavior. So the idea that you must keep buying, that, you know, buying is happiness, right? Because the moment that happens, that's when markets expand, right? So neoliberalism is premised on changing customs, traditions, and mores of society. Now, here the middle class plays a very important role in bringing about neoliberalism in various societies, right? Because the middle class is the vehicle for these neoliberal ideals. Middle class mentalities produce the desire for wealth and material well-being as a kind of natural and universal value, that everyone should believe in material well-being, everyone should believe in the consumerist value. Now, neoliberal markets, however, produce global inequalities. They tend to benefit only the economic elites, which includes, say, CEOs of corporations, entrepreneurs who've made fortunes in new economic sectors such as information technology, biotechnology, and global media. And for the vast majority, actually, it leads to exploitation and material ill-being rather than well-being. According to Berthoud, neoliberalism has ushered generally uneven forms of development, and it has created three categories or class of people. The first is the ultra-rich, the economic elites who have accumulated a lot of wealth and consume conspicuously. They are generally sort of transnational in nature, and they are highly geographically mobile. Then you have the middle classes who balance production with consumption. And finally, you have a majority of people who are poor and who struggle to survive in this new system. To conclude, what I want to say is that this process of deregulation, which is basically the privatization and the withdrawal of the state from responsibilities of cultural regulation, which then becomes subject to sort of market forces, has led to certain forms of cultural homogenization, right? And the spread of American and Western values, that drive the globalization of markets, so that, you buy certain goods and products that are produced by transnational corporations in the West, or say, in certain Asian countries like Japan, etc. Now, what Stuart Hall here is trying to point out is that when we think of deregulation, what we think is that the state recedes and hence market freedoms are permitted, right? And we think of market is equal to freedom and state is equal to regulation and unfreedom. So we create this dichotomy that market leads to freedom, states lead to unfreedom. And here Stuart Hall is pointing out that even when we say that neoliberalism is associated with market freedom, etc., markets are not free in at least two senses. Firstly, that the market cannot operate on its own, but it requires a certain set of social and cultural conditions of existence, which has to be provided by the state in some sense. And secondly, the market itself starts to function as a regulating mechanism by producing winners and losers, as it were. And it also produces managerial and organizational culture that involves rules, procedures, and internalized goals. So then Stuart Hall is very clear in pointing out that this shift from state-led to market-led development is actually not a shift from, unfreedom to freedom. Rather, it's a new form of regulation. We're simply shifting from one mode of regulation to another mode of social regulation, right? And at the moment of deregulation, what Stuart Hall notices is that the states, to remain relevant, actually they start regulating certain other domains of society, particularly, certain aspects of social life like sexuality, morality, standards of public conduct, behavior, and family, and so forth, right? Because the idea is that the market may weaken social bonds of authority and moral consensus within nation states, and here then the state intervenes to maintain a national culture and moral order. So again, the idea that, when we say that with neoliberalism states recede, that may not be the case, that neoliberalism actually has a specific role for states where they play an important role in re-regulation of societies by producing a national culture, by producing a moral order. So it's important then to understand that the apparently contradictory forces of deregulation and re-regulation, they provide an incisive commentary on the sort of the inextricable relationship between markets and the state in whatever combinations of freedom and constraints that they function in, and that characterize the modern sort of juggernaut of late capitalist society. So it's not, it's important to understand that it's never truly state versus the market, but it's always the state and the market at various levels of, and combinations of freedom and constraints. Thank you.